This is an ABC podcast.
Hello and welcome. Today on Conversations from Home, we're bringing you stories of extreme captivity. These are true stories of how people live, survive and thrive when they can't go outside and they have to live in confined spaces for weeks and months on end. And I've been thinking quite a lot about Iceland over the past week as I've been stuck inside in my home. I spent around 3 weeks in the wintertime in Iceland a few years ago. It was dark nearly all the time. The pale sun just sort of bobbed up at around 11 a.m. for a few hours and then went back to bed. And there are places in the north of Iceland where people live in total darkness for months. And they have howling blizzards that will push you down the street if you don't lean into them at a 45-degree angle. So what does that mean? How do people cope? The obvious person to talk to about this is my good friend Kari Gislason. Kari is an Icelandic Australian author and academic who's based in Brisbane, who spent most of his boyhood on that island of Iceland, living between extremes of light and dark. Hello, Kari.
Hello, Richard.
Tell me what you remember from your boyhood in Iceland, about the time when you would notice that winter was approaching.
The thing I remember most clearly is where I used to live, we used to have to catch the bus, into town and into school. And the bus would go up this hill and then it would go over the crest of the hill. And I'd get a look at Ayrshire, which is a mountain that sits across from the Bay of Reykjavik. And every morning I got to see Ayrshire and I got to see its changing colours and I got to see, the kind of patterns on the mountain. And around September, the first snows would arrive in Iceland. And I always remember that moment where you'd see your first sort of line of snow on the top of Ayrshire. And even though I was a kid and even though I loved playing in snow, as soon as I saw that line of first fall, I felt this dread because I knew, what it meant. It meant that winter was coming, and it meant that lovely feeling of summer and green and light was coming to an end.
Is it a progressive state? Like you'd get a lot of snow for a bit, and then you would get the dark times. And would there be blizzards in Reykjavik at that time as well?
Well, because, Reykjavik's right on the sea, the snow doesn't always settle for very long. It snows one day and then all of a sudden it's warm and then the snow comes back. So yeah, it was something that kind of crept in to the town. Now, gradually winter was coming step by step. But you knew that winter had really hit when you got your first big storms. And in Iceland, a storm is not an afternoon thing. A storm is a week of wind, the sound of the wind, hearing it constantly outside, this kind of scream. And then as soon as you walk outside, getting pushed back, by the wind. The wind hits the face, sleet and snow, and you know that winter's arrived.
And in the darkness too, like a blizzard outside in the middle of the day or thereabouts, but in darkness too. I can't imagine what that's like, Kari.
The funny thing is it doesn't feel as though you're really protected inside either. Icelanders live in sort of earthquake-proof housing with double glazing. All the houses are warmed by geothermal water, so you're very comfortable inside. But when it's dark and when it's blowing really, really hard, the weather feels as though it's there. It feels as though it's part of your mentality, part of how you feel. There isn't really a sense of being cocooned from it. You feel as though the weather is giving you no choices but to be a partner in it. They insist on you being involved somehow.
It's the question that Icelanders hate the most, but you have to ask them, how do they live in that darkness and captivity where you're trapped inside for weeks while there's a howling storm outside, Kari?
One of the cliches about, Scandinavia and Scandinavians is that they create sort of a cozy, comfortable environment inside, and it's true that the Scandinavians are great at design and the interiors are beautiful. But I don't think coziness is really what you want when you're trapped inside, as much as you want openness. You can't get outside. It's dark outside. You're tired because it's dark, sort of unnaturally tired. And so in those moments, what you really want to do is to bring the light in and to bring the wider world in. I mean, I just remember as a child craving those long kind of summer evenings. And I think that's where books come into it. I think that's why Icelanders are so obsessed with books. This is a reserved people. You know, Icelanders are known for not saying hello in the street, are known for, not smiling at each other, are known for not making small talk. And yet Icelanders are actually intensely interested in each other, intensely curious about each other, very gossipy place. It's a small place, a small country where everyone is sort of either related or know each other really well. What do you do to bridge that gap that is created by the storms and by the wind and by the cold? And I think the answer is you bring that world in with books. Books give them the exchange, that the outside world denies, and the inside world becomes, a place of marvel. It becomes the whole world inside your apartment.
Didn't you once tell me that Iceland has the greatest number of published authors per capita head compared to any other country in the world?
The statistic is a little bit frightening, to be honest with you, Richard. 1 in every 10 Icelanders will publish a book. And there's only so many things you can write about in Iceland.
Dark outside today. Yeah.
That's right. And it turns out the number one topic is each other. So that's 1 in 10 people writing about the other 9. But there's a market for it. There's this incredible market for biographies, ævisögur, stories about people's lives. And they're very detailed. And people love that entry into the minutiae of the people who live around them, and they sort of soak it up. And I think that's to do with familiarity. If you know every farm that's mentioned, and you know the street next to that corner where the corner shop used to be, where the school comes out, if you know all of those details, you're actually really open to them because they all feel relevant. And I think in Iceland, everyone else's life feels relevant to yours. You need to know each other that way.
Do you see that as a sign of madness or a sign of deep sanity, Kari?
Oh gosh, it's some combination of both, isn't it? Because you want a community to work that way, where we all care about each other and are interested in each other's lives, and yet it's hard not to feel the intrusion as well. When a community is so small and so historically bound together, an island people who've been living separated from the world until really the 20th century, when the world kind of came back into Iceland. There's something unnaturally close about all of that, and it brings with it gossip. Everybody knows who's been doing what, how much money they earned last year, who they're trying to seduce. Everybody knows who wants that other job that's coming up soon. And there's something dispiriting about all that. And yet it's gorgeous as well, because when you walk back into it, when I go back into that world, having been away, I do feel as though I'm being embraced. Like the closeness is an embracing one.
How about children, Kari? How have children managed to live in the captivity of the winter darkness and winter storms?
I don't think anyone feels it as much as children do. In summer, children are allowed to play outside all night. Can you imagine that? No bedtime, no curfew, no being called inside for dinner.
This is a common thing?
This is common, yeah. And this is, my mum was English, and she used to sort of call me in at 11 at night, and all my friends thought she was terribly strict. Like, 11 at night, really? You have to go to bed already? and that's because night doesn't mean anything. Like, it doesn't mean anything to come in at 11 or 1 or 3. It's light all the time. So time becomes a suspended in summer. It becomes just whatever the pattern of your life wants time to be, and that's just so exciting as a child. The holidays in Iceland are so long, so because of the connection to farming and kids being needed on farms, it was traditional for kids to go on holiday in May and not come back to school until September. And it was as though you were allowed to drift and just see what you came across. In September, it kind of suddenly ends and everyone bunkers down and works really hard. Winter is the school year. It goes from September to May. It's really when you do as much of the work as you can, and people work really hard in that time. Books and reading become part of that level, that intense working life. One of my favorite writers from Iceland is the Nobel laureate Halldór Laxness, and he was interested in children's points of view in these quiet, dark times when everyone is sort of working hard, working solidly. And there's some beautiful writing in his books about children, kind of how they see the world in these moments. In one, Independent People, his really famous book, there's this scene where a boy is lying in bed and he wakes up and it's still dark and the rest of the household isn't stirring yet. And he's lying in a bed near the kitchen and he can see the pots and pans. And he starts imagining all of the pots and pans talking to each other and how they must be rivals for things and all the little disputes that these pots and pans are having in the morning before everyone wakes up. And what I find really gorgeous about that is the way that in these quiet, darker moments, the imagination flares up and the poetry emerges. Despite the cold and despite the hostility outside. I don't think the response is necessarily to accept the cold. I think part of the response is to let the imagination bring in another kind of world and create another kind of world inside.
Another aspect of the present moment we're living through, Kari, is the extreme focus on personal cleanliness. Are Icelanders particularly obsessed with the whole personal cleanliness thing?
You know that Iceland was a very poor country, from, say, the Middle Ages all the way to the First World War. Icelanders were living in crofts. So these were just turf-covered houses with stone wall. And the stone wall was the interior wall as well, and the flooring was usually just dirt or packed dirt or maybe some hay over the packed dirt to make it feel more comfortable. So Icelanders were living really kind of close to the mud and to the dirt and to the rocks and to the turf. They even had sheep living inside the houses just to help warm them. And I remember asking a friend who was an anthropologist once, why, how did people stay clean, in these circumstances? Icelanders must have been filthy, in the old days. And he said it doesn't really work that way. When you feel the dirt around you, when you feel, the walls kind of coming in from the landscape, you become the center of an alternative. Like you become the cleanliness in the place. And actually, Icelanders have long been obsessed with cleanliness and with swimming. Swimming is the number one sport in Iceland, in the hot pools of the countryside. Bathing was always a big deal in Iceland. And I remember from my childhood, like one of the worst things you could ever do was to walk into someone's house with your shoes on. And every house in Iceland has a sort of area where, in quite a ritualistic way, you take off your shoes and you put on your inniskor, your inside shoes, and you take off your jacket. And it's like an announcement is made that you've moved from the outside world into this interior world. And that existed even when people lived in the crofts, kind of lived in the dirt. They became obsessed with cleanliness.
This reminds me of when I've been in slums and I've seen the door open to a house in a slum area and see incredibly pristine looking people walk out of them in beautifully pressed, spotless clothes.
I think when you're forced to live in, really difficult and modest, closed environments, you have the option to imagine something else for yourself. And I think what Icelanders were doing, and maybe this has parallels with people in slums, is that they were, imagining a cleanliness and a presentability that was an alternative to their lived reality. Icelanders are quite formal people, and the rules of hospitality are quite strict. I was talking about Halldór Laxness before. Another one of his books, it's called Under the Glacier. It's about a priest who's sent out into the countryside to investigate a case. A body has turned up. It's been spat out by a glacier, and it sort of throws up a theological problem. What do you do with the remains of a person who's been sitting in a glacier for however long, hundreds of years, and has suddenly kind of come out from the bottom? And he goes to all of these farms and asks people about it. And everywhere he goes, the same thing happens. They invite him into the parlor, they tell him to sit down, and then they serve him coffee and cakes. And by the end of his sort of first few days on the road, all he's had to eat and drink is coffee and cake. And he feels completely sick, and he just wants some plain food. And what Laxness was kind of satirizing there was, the formality of reception, giving people a sense that they've entered your world and that you're going to offer them the finest thing you have, even in very, very poor farms.
You lived for a year in the northwest fjords of Iceland in a little village called Ísafjörður, and you were a school teacher there for a year. Now, that's a special place because it's in a fjord, and the walls of the fjord rise up so high that the sun can't get over it in winter. So there's absolutely no sun. It's total darkness throughout winter for months and months. Can you just explain how the people in Ísafjörður know when the sun is back, how they mark it, and what kind of a festival they have for when the sun is about to return? I'm just thinking ahead here of when we have the vaccine, when it's perfectly all right to go out and hug and kiss one another again. Can you just explain what happens in Ísafjörður when it's okay to come out and embrace the sun again?
Yeah, well, Iceland is a bit like Australians. They're obsessed with coffee. So everything you do, if you want to mark a moment, it's normally a coffee. You have coffee available in your kitchen all day, just in case someone comes along and needs a coffee. And in Ísafjörður, when the sun is about to hit the town again, there's a little house on the corner of one of the streets on the spit in Isafjord that goes out into the fjord and sort of almost reaches around the end of the fjord. And that particular house has a corner window, and it's the first window to get a touch of sun. And when the sun finally makes it up over the mountains and hits the corner window of this house, they relay the message that the sun has come back. And the whole town begins what's known as the Sun Coffee Festival. So everybody has coffee and pancakes and cake and sandwiches, and schools stop to have one of these sun coffees. And it's just their way of welcoming the sun back into their lives and acknowledging it communally, that the sun is part of all of our lives together.
You're inside at the moment. Your whole family's inside. You've got 2 young kids who are going to be pinging around like ball bearings in a milk bottle, Kari, for the next however many months. How on earth are you going to cope? You don't have an answer for this, do you?
I love my children very much, Richard. And I value their education enormously. So I have asked my younger son to draw up a possible timetable for his activities at home, but he only got to kind of morning tea, and then threw the piece of paper in the bin. So I don't know what that tells you about our planning. I have to say it's in its infancy, and I may still be slightly in denial that the 4 of us are going to be under the same roof every day.
Well, I'm going to check up on you in a month or so to see if some Lord of the Flies situation hasn't taken over in your household, or the boys are in charge and are roasting you on a spit or something like that. So I'll check on you regularly, Kari, and alert the authorities if that's necessary.
That's very good of you, Richard. And of course, I will be doing all the other things, such as teaching them how to play the guitar, how to read more than one book a year, and drawing, and all of the other skills of the Renaissance.
That's right. All those fine words you've had about books so far, you'll have to put that into action with your own kids now.
Yeah, I just remembered that I sort of sold a vision, and not sure that I've worked it out in my own life yet.
Thank you so much, Kari.
Okay, thanks, Richard.
Kari Gislason is currently writing a new novel based on one of the Icelandic sagas.
This is Conversations with Richard Feidler, podcast, broadcast and online.
On Conversations from Home today, we've got a theme, stories of extreme captivity. Candice Fox is on the line. Candice is a best-selling crime fiction writer whose books are sold all over the world. Candice likes to get right inside the characters and the places that she writes about. The last time she was here, she was talking about visiting a serial killer in jail. For the book she's currently writing, Candice wanted to go inside a maximum security prison, to a place where some of Australia's most serious criminals are forced to endure each other's company. Candice has a new novel that's just been released called Gathering Dark. Candice, where are you now? Are you in your study where you do your writing at the moment?
I am actually in my study, which is all packed up because I'm moving house, and I have a book coming out. So my whole world is in shambles at the moment. Everything's in boxes, and I'm like, what if the movers don't turn up, the moving company? shuts down. I'll be stuck between two houses.
Oh, that's so weird. Moving house during the middle of this crisis is so strange.
Yeah, it is. And we're thinking, because it's a week, it's like we'll leave a week's worth of supplies out. And then you think, well, what if we need more than that? Should we just, I don't know. It's weird. I don't know how to prepare for this kind of thing.
It sounds to me like so much of Australia is learning to live like a writer at the moment. You're working, if you can, from home, with no certain income for the foreseeable future.
Exactly right. A lot of time spent being a writer is sitting around being anxious about things. So people are on the internet saying, I'm stuck at home, I'm bored, I don't know what to do, I'm really anxious, I don't know what my future is going to be like. I'm like, welcome to my world. I was talking to Val McDermott the other day about knitting because she's stuck at home as well, and it's vaguely familiar but also very strange.
I was going to ask you about this because I saw on your website you've got a picture of your desktop which includes writing instruments, but there's also a pile of knitting.
Yes.
I didn't know you were a knitter. What do you knit for, Candice?
Other people. I just, if someone's having a baby, I make baby hats. I also crochet and I embroider, and I like to work with wood as well. I've always been very restless and fidgety, and, I pick and scratch and bite my nails. And it's funny, since I had a baby, I've stopped biting my nails for the first time in 25 years because my hands are just never free. I always have a baby. I've done everything I possibly can to break that habit over the last 2.5 decades, and all I need to do is have a baby.
The last time I saw you, you were very pregnant, and so you've had the baby, and her name is Violet?
Yes.
And was the whole birthing process pretty straightforward for you?
Not at all, no. When I was pregnant, everyone was saying, you've got to have a birth plan and you write it out, and I saw examples of birth plans, and then it was just chaos when I started to have her. She was 10 days early, and I got preeclampsia, and so the whole pregnancy, I thought to myself, there's two options. Either I'll have drugs and they'll say, you want some drugs? And I'll say, yes, please. And they'll give them to me. Or I'll say, no, I don't want any drugs. And so I'd said to Tim, I want to know what this experience of having a baby is like. I want to experience the pain because all my life I've heard about how bad it is. And so I experienced the pain for about 10 minutes. And then I said, okay, I'll have my epidural now. And they said, no. And I said, what? They said, no, you can't have it. I said, I can't, what? Can I have anything? Can I have morphine or whatever? They said, you can have gas. And I went, oh my God, I have to go through this whole thing. And it was 5.5 hours just because of the preeclampsia. I couldn't have an epidural. And then when I was having her, there were about 20 people in the room because they thought I was going to have a stroke. There was this guy and he was in a different uniform to everyone else, and it was a student hospital, this kind of thing, and he was trying to take my blood and he couldn't find a vein and all this kind of stuff, and so he finally gets the vial of blood, and then he dropped it and the vial hit the ground and sprayed blood everywhere. And I waited for him to leave the room. I thought he had left the room, but he'd actually just gone behind a curtain, Tim told me. But I said, I understand you've got to have students here, but that guy is not to touch me again. You keep him away from me. And they said he's not a student. He's actually one of the doctors.
Oh, Candice.
And then I said, how much longer do you think I'm before I have the baby? And she said, look, I think you're going to have it in about an hour. So I remember I looked at the clock and I said, okay, the big hand is between the 4 and the 5. And I looked away and I thought, oh, okay, it must be 20 minutes. Surely that was 20 minutes. And I looked back and it was on the 5. It had literally been 2 or 3 minutes. And I just went, I said to her, I can't do this. I literally just can't do this. And they were like, well, you're going to have to. You got no choice. And after all that, I had this beautiful moment, because I had waited my whole pregnancy to know what the gender of the baby was, and I was speculating the whole time, and we did that thing where you put the ring over the top of the belly and the pendulum or whatever, and I got a 3D scan and I looked at the baby's face and I was like, oh, is it a boy, is it a girl? Anyway, as soon as she came out, before I'd seen her at all, I'm staring at the ceiling and I said, what is it, what is it, what is it? Wanting to know. and the midwife picked her up and turned her around and thrust her at me like vagina first, and she was like she was like 4 inches from my face, like, and the midwife goes, "Look for yourself," and I was like, okay, so this is the first thing I've ever seen of my baby. I haven't seen anything else. I've just seen a little vagina flying at me. And I was so shocked and horrified by the whole experience that I looked at it and I was like, which one is that? Like, is that a boy? What? I don't know what I'm looking at here. Really, I did not do it very stoically. Like, a friend of mine said to me, you know, I there was no screaming. I basically didn't make any noises at all. It was all very calm. But I got religious in the middle of it. Like, I'm not very religious. I guess you'd call me agnostic. But I was saying to Tim, "Pray with me, Tim, pray with me," like that. Later on, I found out that a few of the people in the room were actually readers of mine, and they knew who I was because I went on to the ward later, and this woman, one of the midwives, said to me, "Are you a famous author?" And I said, "Oh, well, you know, I do all right." And she said, "Oh, there's a bunch of ladies out there who are talking about you because they're your readers." And I thought, oh, my God, they've seen parts of me that no other reader is ever going to see.
Conversations.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, you put out something on Twitter. You put out a tweet and you said, "Well, I'm about to go do something as fascinating as it is dangerous in the name of research for writing your crime novels. Can't wait to tell you all about it if I survive, maybe when I appear on the next R. Feidler program," which is what you're on now. What was this thing that you went to do for your research that was so dangerous?
Well, the novel that I'm supposed to start now involves a prison breakout. And so I asked, without much hope, I said to a friend of mine who works in Corrections New South Wales, I said, "Could you get me inside a prison? Because I haven't been in a prison since I was a kid." I went and visited a serial killer on death row, but I didn't get to look around the prison. So I said to him, "Can you get me a tour?" And I thought, you know, it's never going to happen. But then he came back and he said, "Yeah, sure. What kind of prison do you want? Do you want a new one or an old one? Do you want minimum, maximum, male, female?" And I went, oh, my God, like, what an amazing thing I get to do for a living, that I can pop up and say, I want to look inside this. Can you get it? And he said, yeah. And so I ended up going to Lithgow Maximum Security Prison to go and look at the facility, and it's a male prison. And, I didn't have a lot of information before I went, except for the fact that the governor got punched in the face the day before I went. So I thought, oh, that's great. The governor is like the warden. So the top person in the whole prison just got punched in the face.
By a prisoner?
By an inmate, yes, by an inmate. Swung at her between the bars. It was only a glancing blow because she said to me, "Look, I've been dodging from inmates for decades," so he didn't get her too bad. But my friend told me, oh, yes, spitting is on the rise in New South Wales prisons. And if you get spat on, you've got to go and do all these blood tests. And, it can be up to 6 months before they figure out, have you got hepatitis, have you got HIV or whatever if you get spat on.
Or COVID-19, as it turns out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so I thought, oh, this will be fun. But if something horrible happens to me, at least it'll make a great interview.
So when you got there, what does the prison look like? Is it one of those kind of old Gothic prisons like the old Pentridge, or is it more one of those ones that sort of looks like an anonymous transport depot?
It looks like an anonymous transport depot. It's very flat and very sort of sparse, and you sort of see it in the distance across all these fields. And there are 3 different levels of security, or what they call sterile zones, going into the prison. So the least sterile is just, it's there are some buildings outside the prison, and the governor has her office in there, and then there's like a ring of 20-foot fences with razor wire, and they've got all these strips of gravel, because you can't run on gravel, and you also can't sort of walk quietly on gravel, and that's got all these sensors in it, like heartbeat sensors. So if a truck drives through there, they scan it with a thing that says, oh yeah, there's only one heartbeat inside the truck, so they can't smuggle anyone out. And they've got sound sensors and x-rays and all this stuff going around. And then when you get in there, it's almost like a big empty school, but with all these like cages and stuff inside it. If you went to a school at night, it would be like that. There are all these sort of anonymous looking buildings, and it was really interesting. The first time I saw an inmate, my reaction was to smile. I found myself smiling at him, and he just looked back at me like, who the hell are you?
So how did they respond to a presence of a woman? Were you like Clarice in Silence of the Lambs, walking past those cells?
Yeah, it was very interesting to them, me being there, because they had no idea that I was going to come. It had been kept from them that I was going to come, because somebody would have staged something. Because there's hundreds and hundreds of guys in there, and they're all trying to look like the toughest, most psycho guy in there. And so a young lady, or youngish, comes from outside to visit an author, and nobody does anything. It would be like, oh man, why didn't you do something? There was a situation like, for example, we went to this workshop and they were assembling the headphones for a certain airline. They give those headphones to you before you get on the plane. I won't say which airline because I fly them a lot and I don't want them to be mean to me.
So they get put together in prison, do they?
Yeah. They have all sorts of interesting stuff they do. They make hospital sheets and they sew hospital scrubs, and they put those headphones together. I've seen other prisons where they do upholstery work. They do call centre work sometimes in female prisons. That's why you should never be mean to anyone that calls you for a call centre job, probably sitting in a prison. So we walked into this room and they were all working on those headphones, and there was sort of, I would say, 50 guys in the room. And as soon as we walked in, it was the governor and I and my friend and a male officer. All the guys just look, and you just feel the atmosphere change, and everybody starts calculating. Like guys are sort of pretending to look over their shoulder, and they're whispering to the guy next to them, and sort of looking and trying to work out who I am. And everywhere you go in the prison, people are pacing all around. It's like a psychological condition of captivity. Animals pace all the time.
So that's real. That's not just in movies where you see prisoners pacing. This really does happen.
Yeah, everywhere they're pacing. Like you see them off in the distance behind some wire, and there's maybe 10 of them pacing. And then there were these two guys just pacing around the outside of the room because they don't have to work. So some of them just turn up and they don't do anything, and they earn $7 a week just for turning up. And then the guys that actually sit there and do the work, they earn like $16 a week or something. So when we first walked into the room, there were two guys pacing all around the perimeter, and they had to go right past us in order to follow their track. So the second time they went around, there was 4 guys, and then the third time they went around, there was 6 guys. And the governor, by that time, she said, we need to get out of here before they do something. And I wanted to go in and look at the tables and look at their equipment and stuff, and she said, no, we won't go in because it's just too dangerous. Like somebody will grab you or something like that.
Did they respond in any kind of sexual way to a woman being present there?
Yeah. When the guys that were pacing around the room, and she said, oh, we got to go, there was this sort of moment of desperation. I think I was watching the guys that were pacing, and I was about to turn away, and I sort of locked eyes with one of them, and he like grabbed his front junk. He grabbed his, and he kind of looked at me in a kind of a like, get a load of this type of way. And I was like, oh, and I don't think the governor or anyone saw it. And I thought to myself, should I say that guy just grabbed his dick at me. And then I thought, you know what? Most women have had a guy do that to them, like across the nightclub or something.
Yeah.
And then I thought, I don't want to be a snitch, because if I go back in there and I point across the room and I say, that was the guy, that one. And how do I say, oh, it was the really mean looking one? They all look really mean. And so I didn't do anything. But it was so strange the way that the staff talked about them, like there were all these men behind the wire, maybe 20 men all sort of sitting around tables and standing in that. And she said, so those are our special protection guys. So they're the rapists and the child molesters and the women killers and that kind of thing. And then, she points to 20 of them. I'm like, there they are. There are the monsters. It was almost like they were zoo animals or something.
In your head, to write your fiction, you've got to live in a world of crime, but there you are in a real day-to-day world of crime inside that prison. Does that feel different from your fiction?
Yeah, it's a lot less glamorous, because I think in crime fiction the criminals are always very smart and interesting. And you see some of these guys, and I've been in some high schools before, like really bad sort of high schools. I studied to be a high school teacher, which was a terrible decision for me, because I'm very sensitive. If someone's mean to me, I usually cry, and teenage boys will say horrible things sometimes. But just the way they were sitting on tables and kicking their legs and kind of looking bored, and a lot of them were very young. And I thought, what the hell are you doing in here? There's maximum security. There are men in there who have been horrible serial killers and terrorists and all sorts of things. And there were guys in there that looked sort of 18 or 19. And so they didn't look very smart, and they didn't look very complicated. And some of them just looked like absolute scumbags, and you just would not want to run into them in the street. And I saw them in all their different sort of scenarios. I went to the clinic and I saw some of the guys sitting in there getting checkups, getting their teeth looked at. And I talked to one of the most interesting conversations I had was with the head nurse, and we were talking about grooming. An inmate will come in and they'll say to you, oh, you look nice today. And then if you sort of accept that, you don't do anything about it and you don't stop it in your tracks, the next time they see you, they say, oh, that's a very nice top, or that looks good on you. And then it sort of advances and advances until they're getting very sexual with you and you can't walk it back, and your colleagues have to come in and sort of say, this is inappropriate, and lock it down. Because all they've got to do all day long is think about how they can create mischief and how they can manipulate the staff to get what they want. And they have the time to work on you and work on you and work on you as a staff member until they have something over you.
So that's what was going on when you walked into the room. There's something new had happened to break the routine, and a lot of them were figuring, what can I do with this change situation? How do I play around the edges of that?
Yeah, and that's why the governor, she kept me moving all around the prison. We went to the library and I signed some of my books in the library, which is a bit funny.
Your books are in the prison library?
Yeah. And I had heard that before. Some of my books were out, but the ones that were remaining, the librarian said, can you write some funny messages in there to the inmates? And so I wrote, Dear Lithgow inmates, I enjoyed my visit, but I don't think I'll stay. Behave yourself, Candice Fox. It was pretty interesting stuff, but just very scary, because when I visited a serial killer in death row in San Quentin, I didn't have a baby, and I thought to myself, I just hope I get home to my baby safe and well. I have more to risk this time.
Has it changed just the way you see the world having a baby?
Yes. Yeah. One of the weirdest effects it's had on me, it's a very strange kind of idea, but you might get what I'm thinking. I sort of realized that everyone was a baby. And so when I thought about that serial killer that I visited in San Quentin, who murdered all those young women, not only did I think about all of his victims having been babies, but I thought about him being a little tiny baby. And Violet is she's such a blank canvas. Every single thing that she experiences is new. And I just thought about, how did you get to be this almost inhuman monster that took all these lives and doesn't care and is not sorry for what he did and all of that, when really you kind of started as a blank canvas. And somebody had to take such care of you, because even the worst care of a baby, for a baby to survive, it needs so much stuff, like she needs to be fed all the time, and she needs to have a place to sleep, which is safe, and she needs to be kept clean. Like, somebody did that for this guy, and then he turned into the worst kind of human being. And my mind was blown about that, really. And what people can become when they all sort of start, relatively the same way. I mean, obviously people are horribly, some people are horribly disadvantaged, and some people have heaps of advantages, and then it's got to do with your brain chemistry and all that. But it made me realise that.
I talked about your knitting earlier, and we're all going to be looking for stuff to do to preoccupy ourselves so we don't all get cabin fever over the months that come. Explain the joy of knitting to me, please, Candice Fox.
Well, you know what? It's a lot like writing a novel, I think. You just start with one stitch, and then 15,000 stitches later, you have something, like it's finished. But in between, you can kind of go, look at this thing, it's growing, and it's growing right before my eyes. And a few hours ago, I had nothing. And if I keep going and I keep pursuing and I just do a little bit at a time, it turns into this big magical thing, which is a lot like a novel. One of the biggest joys of writing a novel is opening the blank document, the very first document, and writing chapter 1. And I always stop and I look at it and I go, this is the start. And in a while, it might be 4 months, 6 months, whatever, I'll be writing the end. And I think about what's ahead, and I think a lot of people do that and they get scared and they go, there's so much to go. Why would I be bothered? Why don't I just go and buy a jumper? Why would I spend 10 hours knitting one or something? But a part of the way through, you can look at it and say, look, I started with nothing and now I have a little bit and I added a little bit more. One of the things I like to think about or say to myself is you can only eat an elephant one bite at a time. And I think about that, and it's a willpower thing. It's getting a third of the way through and not giving up, just saying I'll just do a little bit more, do a little bit more, do a little bit more. That's how I feel about it.
It's been so lovely to speak with you, Candice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's always a joy, Richard.
Candice Fox is the author of a great many works of crime fiction. Her most recent novel is Gathering Dark. abc.net.au/conversations is our website. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.